Pues muy buenas tardes a todos. Les damos
Good afternoon. We welcome you to this second session of the series of training that we are organizing about good regulatory practices and its implementation in the sector of medical devices. Under the project of regulatory convergence for medical devices that we are organizing in collaboration with COFEPRIS, USAID, ANSI, and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence. We're going to start with some logistics to make sure that the session runs smoothly for everyone. As you read, when you joined the session, this session is being recorded for its post in the website of the coalition, and we will also include all the presentations that the speakers will be sharing with us today. We have simultaneous interpretation into English. Can you please mute your microphones? Thank you. As I was telling you, we have simultaneous interpretation into English. You can access it through the icon at the bottom right of your menus. The microphones of all the participants are muted to avoid background noise and not affect the presentations. We ask you to ask your questions in the Q&A icon that is also at the bottom of your screen. If you write down your questions in the chat, we run the risk of not seeing them, and you will miss the opportunity of answering them. So if you can ask your questions in the Q&A section, we would appreciate that. For the speakers, we ask you to turn on your cameras when you start your presentation because this facilitates the work of the interpreters. So with this logistics, with these housekeeping announcements, now we are going to share the agenda for today. We will have a welcome message from Roberto Morales, the Deputy Director of the International Area of COFEPRIS. Then we will review the good regulatory practices, the regulation of medical products. Then we will talk about the regulatory process in Mexico specifically, and then we would close the session today. With this, I'm going to give the floor and welcome Roberto Morales so that he may address the audience. Roberto. Thank you, Sandra. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you in the presentation of the Federal Commission Against the Protection of Sanitary Risks in Mexico, and along with the Alliance of the Standards of the US, we welcome you to this second session of the workshop on good regulatory practices and its implementation in the sector of medical devices. Today, we are going to focus on the application, both nationally and internationally, and we will have special guests, among them Dr. Agnes Quijo from the WHO, and from the Ministry of the Economy, the Director of Process Improvement and Promotion of the General Directorate of Standards, Juan Carlos Rivera. And from COFEPRIS, we have Edgar Castillo from the General Legal and Consultative Coordination. They are going to share their knowledge about this through normative tools and also the recommendations that the UN promotes for a better regulatory practice. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you that since CONAMER couldn't confirm their participation, there's a modification in the agenda, but the rest of the agenda is as Sandra said. I'd like to remind you that this event is within the framework of regulatory convergence of medical devices. And the purpose of this is to foster the use of good regulatory practices in the process of alignment of the regulatory systems with international standards in the scope of medical devices, but it's also useful for other products. With this workshop and with the project in general, COFEPRIS and the USAID, ANSI and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence wish to find a model to optimize evaluation and authorization processes with more regulatory harmonization with the best international practices that will be reflected on a more efficient and transparent planning with fewer obstacles and improvements in the access to health of patients. Finally, I'd like to wish you the best in this event and I urge you to participate in the Q&A session. This workshop was organized for all of you, so please take advantage of it, and please, we hope you learn from our experts in the context of good regulatory practices. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to give the floor to our guests so that we can formally begin this second session of our workshop. Thank you very much. We give the floor to Ivan Calderon to introduce Agnes and moderating this session. Thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon. Now, we are going to present the block on good regulatory practices, the regulation of medical products. This is a presentation by Agnes Kigo that represents the World Health Organization. She will show us the global perspective and recommendations of the WHO for medical devices. As it is well known, governments and specifically regulatory agencies must protect and promote the health of population through guarantees of safety, quality, and efficacy of the inputs services for health. To this end, we need clear, normative, transparent, coherent, unbiased, proportionate, and timely rules with that are evidence-based. So we recur to harmonized principles recognized internationally that are understood and synthesized and promoted with bodies like WHO to facilitate the implementation of efficient regulatory systems. I'm going to introduce Agnes Kijo. She has a degree as a pharmaceutical in Chennai, India, with a master's degree in pharmaceutical technology from King's College in London. She has worked in health systems, research, planning, and implementation of programs. At present, she participates in the coordination of the work group for the update of the global model of the regulatory framework for medical devices, GMRF of the WHO. She has a lot of expertise in quality assurance in drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics. She was general director of the Authority of Food and Drugs in Tanzania. She has worked for more than 18 years in regulatory affairs, and also she was chair of the work group of regulatory harmonization in PANA. In charge, well, a post to improve the access to medical devices and safe and affordable diagnosis in Africa. At present, she is technical officer of regulation and safety of the Department of Regulation and Pre-Qualification of the WHO. You have the floor, Ms. Kijo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ivan, for the introduction. So I will repeat briefly, and maybe before that, let me just say hello to everyone. Good morning this evening. It's 7 where I am right now in Geneva. As introduced by Ivan, my name is Agnes Sita Kijo from the WHO headquarters. From the Facilitated Product Introduction Team, which is under the Regulation and Safety Unit, one of the units under the Regulation and Pre-Qualification Department. I'm very happy and honored to be here this evening to present to you about the recently published Good Regulatory Practices by WHO. And also 3 other important tools that supports implementation of good regulatory practices in terms of effectiveness of the regulatory systems and regulatory systems strengthening for medical products, but with a special focus on medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics. I have a slight issue on my connections here, and so allow me to just switch off my video so that I can switch to a larger screen to be able to see the presentation well. So with that, I will switch off my video, but I will try to speak slowly so that the interpretation can be swift. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I will start with a bit of a background information on this very popular slide to talk briefly about how WHO is contributing to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 3 on good health, but more specifically target 3.8, which reads to achieve universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality essential health care services, and access to safe, effective, quality and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all. So this Sustainable Development Goal is implemented through the 13th WHO Global Program of Work of 5 years from 2019 to 2023. And with the 3 strategic priorities, which is 1 on health coverage, 1 billion more people with health coverage. The second is on health emergencies, 1 billion more people made safer. And the last is on health priorities, where we are aspiring to have 1 billion lives improved. So the division where I'm working, the division of access to medicines and other health products, which is led by Dr. Mariangelo Simao, who is an Assistant Director General, has translated the 13th Global Program of Work into 5 years plan, action plan, to help build effective and efficient regulatory system. So I will speak briefly on these important tools developed by the WHO to support national regulatory authorities in building effective and efficient medical products systems. Next slide, please. And so the focus of my presentation will be on the tools, which is mentioned here in this presentation outline. So first is good regulatory practice principles, good reliance practice principles, WHO regulatory system strengthening activities, and then global model regulatory framework for medical devices, including IVDs. Next slide, please. Next. So this presentation, the first few slides, I'm going to speak about the WHO good regulatory practices. It is important for regulatory authorities to have robust system. And this was recognized by the 67th World Health Assembly in May 2014. Member states endorsed the World Health Assembly Resolution 67.20, calling for WHO to support member states to have effective regulatory systems as an essential component of health system strengthening. And so the resolution also recognized that regulators are an essential part of health work, and that inefficient regulatory system can be a barrier to access to medical products, including medical devices. And so this also reinforced a need to have this document developed. So the purpose of the good WHO good regulatory practice is really, it presents the high-level principles on good regulatory practices, but also principles to serve as benchmarks. All the principles of the good regulatory practices have been embedded within the other tools that I'm going to speak about in the next slides of my presentation, but also to guide member states in prioritizing their regulatory activities according to resources, national goals, public health policies, medical product policies, and the medical product environment. It is relevant to all regulators, irrespective of resources, maturity, or regulatory models, whether it's supranatural, which is regional, national, or subnational regulatory systems. Related audience, apart from the national regulatory authorities, are policymakers, other regulatory networks, and the other regulated parties. Next slide, please. So the main objective of the WHO good regulatory practice really is to ensure that there is sound and effective regulation of medical devices, understanding the criticality of the role that is undertaken by this agency to safeguard the health of the public. Higher quality regulations, better regulatory decision-making and compliance, but more efficient regulatory systems and better public health outcomes, and also to address the SDG goal 3, but also update on to have an update regulatory system, promoting trust among regulatory authorities and other stakeholders, because once you have a robust regulatory systems, then other regulatory authorities will have confidence in terms of the work that is performed by the respective national regulatory authorities, but also it facilitates international cooperation. The good regulatory practice guidance document is complemented by other tools. I'll speak about the other two tools today, but there are other tools such as the good governance practices, good review practices, good reliance practices, which I'm going to speak about on my next slide, and then implementation of quality management systems for regulatory authorities. This is a very recent publication by the WHO to guide regulatory authorities on how to introduce a quality management system. I will also describe a little bit on how the two documents link. And so I think this is like the most, can you go to the next slide, please? And so this is like the core slide as far as good regulatory practices is concerned. So we have 9 high-level principles that are described through the good regulatory practices guidance document. And these are the principles that are advocated for NRIs, and it has been embedded within the global benchmarking tool and form part of the assessment of the national regulatory authorities through specific sub-indicators, which I'm going also to speak on the other slides. So the 9 high-level principles include legality, consistency, independence, impartiality, proportionality, flexibility, clarity, efficiency, and transparent. And I'm just going to go quickly through the 9 high-level principles just to describe briefly what they are. But I have provided a link as well on the slides on these important documents that you can go back and review more details to have clarity in terms of what these 9 principles are calling for. But briefly on legality, really it's speaking about regulations which should have sound legal basis. It means that regulatory framework should provide necessary authority to the regulatory authority, define clearly what is the scope, and flexibility to safeguard and promote health, as we have witnessed recently during the pandemic. Issues around delegation of power, clarity on roles and responsibilities at various levels of the regulatory systems. I'll give you an example where I come from. There were a lot of issues in terms of introducing regulation of medical devices and IVDs because of the multiple institutions that are overseeing quality and safety of these products. And it's historical. So most of the countries, this is still a major issue as far as regulation of medical devices is concerned. And so legality really speaks about those elements. Issues around consistency, that regulation should be clear and predictable and should be implemented and enforced consistently for all medical product sectors and to all stakeholders. Independence. So the regulatory authority or the regulatory systems must operate and seem to be operating in an independent and authoritative manner, discharging its duties independently from other external forces. We all have experiences in terms of the influences that come from the external parties, including politicians. Impartiality, regulations that regulation and regulatory decisions should be impartial, should not be biased, it should be fair and avoid conflict of interest. but also proportionality, such that it is based on risk and should not exceed what is necessary to achieve the objective of the regulatory authority. But also the issue of flexibility, as we have witnessed during the pandemic, where market authorization was issued within lesser days as compared to normal routine days of the regulatory authorities. I remember one institution presented to say a product that used 24 or 36 months to get registered was registered within 12 months during the time of the pandemic. So such kind of framework that provides flexibility is advocated by WHO. Issues around efficiency in terms of reaching the targeted timelines, effort and cost, but also issues around transparent. Next slide, please. To be able to have an effective regulatory system with the desired output, the desired outcome and regulatory impact, regulators need to have something called good regulatory practices enabler. So as much as you would have a legal framework or regulations that address the 9 principles of good regulatory practices, but you also need some enablers. So some of the enablers that are advocated or recommended by the WHO is on the issue of political and government support, sustained support at the highest political and government level, issues around effective organization and good government, supported with good leadership, intra and intra-organizational communication, collaboration and coordination among stakeholders and the national regulatory authorities, a robust and well-functioning quality management system, which I have spoken about a little bit, supported by the newly published. There is a background noise.
Sí. Yes, sorry, Agnes, can you give us a second so we can close the mics?
Thanks. I think it's off now. So the first one is robust and well-functioning quality management system, in which WHO has already published recently a guidance document on how regulators can introduce quality management systems elements, understanding how critical enabler is for instituting good regulatory practices within the national regulatory authorities, but also sufficient and sustainable financial resources. We all understand how important sustainability of finances to run the regulatory authority in a good manner. So you need to have sustainable resources, but also competent human resources, preset organization ethics and values. So there has to be a defined administrative document or regulations that describes ethics and manners or values in which the regulatory authorities or regulatory personnel should abide by ethical principles or any organizational values or something like that. Science and data-driven decision-making process. Of course, decision of the regulatory authority need to be based on scientific foundation and of course, accuracy in terms of data rather than intuition or arbitrariness. So I think these are the key important enablers to be able to implement successfully the 9 principles I've mentioned. So I'm going to go, I'm being mindful of the time, but I will go quickly on good reliance practices. So good reliance practices is actually one of the supporting document to the implementation of good regulatory practices, because it actually, can you please go to the next slide? And the next one, please. Yes. So the principles of reliance, so good reliance practice is one of the document that is supporting the implementation of good regulatory practice, in a sense that there are some of the principles that are advocated within the good reliance practices that would assist the regulatory authorities to implement some of the elements of the good regulatory practices. And so what are the principles of reliance? Principles of reliance are based on international cooperation to ensure the safety, quality, and efficacy or performance of locally used medical products or products that have been issued market authorization. Understanding that even for the best resource regulatory authority, no one can do it alone. And so principles of reliance really advocates on cooperation, understanding the limited resources that's available in many of the, that's not available in many of the regulatory authorities. But also it advocates on making best use of the available resources and expertise as much as possible to avoid duplication and concentrate on regulatory efforts and resources where most needed. So instead of repeating assessment of a technical file that has been assessed by your neighboring national regulatory authorities, you can use the expertise and resources to assess another product that has not been assessed by any trusted institution or any other regulatory authorities that you're relying on. And so this really promotes a more efficient approach to regulatory oversight, but also improve access to quality assured, effective and safe medical devices over the entire life cycle. And I'm going to give an example of a collaborative registration procedure, which is advocated by WHO, that instead of WHO is sharing assessment outcome of the technical files, and expect that the information is shared by the regulatory authority with the consent of the manufacturer, and the product is registered within 90 days. And so these are some of the examples and the concept around reliance that WHO is advocating. But another principle is the act where the regulatory authority in one country takes into account or gives significant weight on the assessment performed by another regulatory authorities or trusted institutions such as WHO to reach its own decision. And there are several reliance approaches that are out there, that's available out there. And then I think the beauty of the one of the principles of the reliance is that the relying authority remains independent in terms of the final decision whether to register the product or not to register the product, regardless of whether it's been pre-qualified by WHO or it has been issued market authorization by a more stringent regulatory authority. Next slide, please. So this slide really speaks about the concept of reliance. I'm not going to speak to the first part and the last part, but I'm just going to stick to the middle part, which speaks about leveraging. Yes, that's the slide. Thank you. I'm going to speak about the middle part that speaks about leveraging regulatory work, because this one really illustrates the concept of reliance. And ideally, what WHO wishes to see really is for regulators to move from making its own reviews, making its own inspections, or carrying out its own performance evaluation, but really to explore or adopting reliance mechanisms or approaches by leveraging regulatory work performed by other competent authorities or trusted authorities. For example, WHO doesn't assess all medical products. There are specific products that have been prioritized in the WHO pre-qualification program. So countries can be able to leverage only on these products, but then use their resources, use their effort and expertise to assess other products that don't fall within the WHO scope. And then later on, countries would move now to the unilateral or mutual recognition by accepting final decision that has been made by other regulatory authorities or trusted institutions. So this was also practiced during the global pandemic, especially at the early days where no one was really sure of the virus, and of course on the assays to be used for clinical diagnosis of the virus. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to really go through this because I'm mindful of the time. If you can go to the next slide, please. So some of the consideration also on implementation of the good reliance practices is on the issue of recognition versus reliance. There has to be more formalized approach to reliance. Unilateral or mutual, I've spoken about the issue around recognition based on binding mutual agreements or treaties between regulatory authorities. Life cycle approach, so it applies across full life cycle of a medical product and all other regulatory functions. It is risk-based approach, and so regulators need to define their own strategy on how they are going to approach these Reliance approaches for different products. If you take an example of medical devices, they have 4 classes, and so regulators may decide to say, we are not going to carry out Reliance on Class A products. Class A products are self-declaratory products, but we are going to do Reliance maybe on high-risk product because of the inadequate capacity to assess Class D product, but maybe Class B and C will be assessed by the individual regulatory authorities. Regional Reliance mechanism, and of course, assessment of the products conducted either centrally based on regional regulatory systems or a group of countries, as we have witnessed in some of the regions, that there is a coordinating organization that assesses the product on behalf of the others, and then the results are shared by the rest of the region or the rest of the regulatory authorities that have entered into a formal agreement with the relying regulatory authority. Next slide, please. So the basis or the main or key issue on the Reliance really is on the sameness of product, but you will be able also to go through this slide and read through to understand. But regulatory authorities, before they can rely to any regulatory authority or any other trusted institution, they need to make sure that the product that they are assessing is the same as what was either pre-qualified or registered by another stringent regulatory authority. So there are guidance on how to assess sameness of the product before you can accept to rely on the outcome of the work that is done by the other regulatory authority. So sameness of a product is key when you decide to engage into any of the Reliance approaches. Next slide, please. Some of the examples, you can also read through these examples. We have MDSAP, which is very popular. It is based on Reliance of a group of countries, but we also have the collaborative registration procedure that I've spoken about. We have recently witnessed Thai FDA in Singapore, regulatory Reliance. So products that have been assessed by Singapore is shared, the report is shared to Thai FDA for them to register the products quickly. The EUL facilitated procedure for SARS-CoV-2 assays, introduced recently also by the WHO for the listed COVID-19 assays, and many other examples of Reliance. Next slide, please. So I'm going to speak again briefly on the WHO regulatory system strengthening, but more specifically on the global benchmarking tool. So this is the objective of the WHO regulatory system strengthening program, to build regulatory capacity, but also to promote regulatory cooperation and convergence based on the previously mentioned WHO resolution 67.20, which really called for strengthening of regulatory systems. Next slide, please. And so the WHO regulatory system strengthening really is guided by this important document, which is called a WHO Global Benchmarking Tool. It is a means by which WHO evaluates regulatory systems through a comprehensive and systematic benchmarking of regulatory systems, identifying strength and areas of improvement, but also identify or formulate institutional development plans to build upon the strength and address the identified gaps, and of course, help to monitor progress and achievement of the regulatory authorities. Next slide, please. And this is based on the global benchmarking tool. Really is based or is in summary the scoring based on maturity level as adopted through the ISO 9004. So it is based on assessment from maturity level 1 to maturity level 4. So NRI can be scored maturity level 1, for example, if some elements of the regulatory system exist after fulfillment of all sub-indicators related to maturity level 1. So there are specific sub-indicators that national regulatory authority will have to abide to in order to be announced as maturity level 1 until maturity level 4. So maturity level 4 is like the highest level where a regulatory authority is announced to have advanced and well-resourced regulatory systems. But WHO really is promoting and encouraging regulators to reach at least maturity level 3, which is termed as stable, well-functioning and integrated regulatory systems. And this is really what WHO is targeting for. The GBT has been recently been revised to include medical devices and IVDs indicators, but the current GBT revision 6, it covers only medicines, vaccines, blood and blood products. We expect to pilot the tool for medical devices and IVDs in Q1 of 2022. So please, Mexico, feel free to indicate your interest also to be assessed using this very innovative tool. Next slide, please. So I'm going to speak briefly on the Global Model Regulatory Framework as well. So this is one of the tools that also has embedded elements of good regulatory practices and good reliance practices. Next slide, please. It is a document that was published in 2017, and there is an ongoing review, actually. It is relevant to WHO member states or regulators for medical devices and IVDs. It recommends 2 steps from basic regulatory controls towards an expanded level, but also it is focused more on the role and responsibilities of the national regulatory authorities. It describes circumstances in which regulatory authority can either rely or recognize the work product from trusted regulatory authorities. It also describes the good regulatory practices principles and good reliance practices principles. The ongoing review is to really expand some of the topics based on the experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic, but on the newly published GRP, good reliance practice, and the other document on post-market and market surveillance of medical devices. So some of the new topics that are aspired to be included in the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework is on UDI, new technologies, implementation, phases, and of course, regulatory pathways. So this is in a nutshell what I wanted to speak to you about today, but also for you to really understand that all the elements that have been described on my previous slides on good regulatory practices are supported by these tools. So once a regulatory authority implements the recommendation of the Global Model Regulatory Framework, or if a country is assessed by using the global benchmarking tool, or if a regulatory authority implements the principles of good reliance practices, then you would be able to safely say that you are implementing the principles of good regulatory practices as recommended by WHO. So this is all I have to share with you, and I would be happy to take any questions. And I hope I haven't really gone out of time. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Agnes, for your presentation. Of course, you kept up your time. And next, we are going to open the floor for 5 minutes of questions and answers. If you wish, you can ask your questions either using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, you can raise your hand to ask for the floor and ask your question directly. So we will have 5 minutes for this activity. And while we start to see the questions, I have a question about Reliance that you mentioned during your presentation. What's the approach in post-approval changes? You were talking about post-approval changes. They are included in the Reliance set. What have been the difficulties you faced when there are post-approval changes?
So do you want me to take all the questions and respond, or would you want me to address them one by one?
Yeah, I can go one by one. I mean, like, as long as I see there's just one question on in the Q&A, and we don't have any other questions on the chat. So please, people, feel free to type your questions on the chat box. The first question that we have in the chat is, who determines which is a reliable country under regulatory practices? Anya.
So let me just respond first to your question, Ivan, and maybe you can repeat the second. I'm not so sure if I got the second question, but on the post-approval changes, I think one of the critical challenge that we have witnessed from the regulatory authorities or received feedback from the regulatory authority or from the WHO side is mostly communication, because sometimes the manufacturer or the applicant may make changes and inform WHO of such changes, but they may not inform the national regulatory authority that there has been changes on the product. But based on the collaborative registration procedure guidance document, information regarding any change post-registration of a WHO pre-qualified product has to be informed to both. It has to be informed to the WHO for them to assess and categorize the changes, whether it's minor or it's major, but also to report such changes to the national regulatory authority so that they can keep track on what are the changes and whether in any way it affects the registration of the product or in any way affects the national requirements of the issuance of marketing authorization in that particular country. So I think in summary, the major concern really is on the communication from the manufacturer to WHO to a national regulatory authority and vice versa.
Yeah, thank you very much. And next question is, who determines which is a reliable country under regulatory practices? I think this question is focused on like the regulatory agencies who are determined to be reliable. And this is like very important as well. Yeah,
this is a very good question. And this is why WHO has come up with the global benchmarking tool, because there is no, you cannot really tell or define who is a better regulatory authority than the other. But the global benchmarking tool that assesses the regulatory systems and mark them in terms of the level of maturity is a tool that really can tell you, for example, if Mexico reaches maturity level 2, or if it reaches to maturity level 4, then definitely countries that are in lower maturity level 1 or maturity level 2, can be able to easily identify and rely on the outcome of a regulatory authority that has reached a higher maturity level than compared to them. And so get yourself assessed. If you reach a higher maturity level 2, then there is more chance for other countries to get interested to collaborate, because then your system will be termed as a stable regulatory systems for medical products.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in this case, we invite the audience to check this GVT as to understand what these maturity levels that you mentioned in the slides.
Yes,
sure.
Yes, and I have shared also on the slides. I've shared a link to the current revision 6 of the GBT. And so once the GBT plus medical devices is available, it's also going to be shared on the same site.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one hand, but let's go with one question. So this question is also very important. So what is the difference between reliance, convergence, and harmonization, according to this talk?
Well, so as I mentioned on my slide, so reliance is more taking advantage of the outcome or assessment done by the other regulatory authorities. So if it's relying on inspection reports, relying on dossier assessment report, or any other report that would facilitate the regulatory authority to make informed decision on whether to register the product or not to register a product. So this is the main concept for reliance, whether you would wish to rely on the reports on the outcome of the other regulatory authority. But when you speak about harmonization, harmonization is mainly really on requirements, such that you want to have, and this is one of the main principles actually of reliance, that if the requirements have been harmonized, then it's easier to trust, it's easier to rely because the requirements are the same. But if the requirements are completely different, then it's difficult for a regulatory authority to trust if such requirements would really determine or would really facilitate oversight of the regulatory authority in terms of confirming safety and performance of the products. And so this is why we are encouraging that requirements as much as possible should be harmonized, and through the regional harmonization initiatives, we have been encouraging countries to really make sure that the requirements are aligned to facilitate reliance.
Sorry, oh yeah, so sorry, Anya, there was one mic open. Sorry. Sorry for that.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, definitely those were like really a well-detailed explanation on what the difference are among those three concepts that might seem to be familiar, right? I mean, like that might it's that they share that same point, one core message, but they are like really different. We have time. I mean, can we confirm we have time for one more question, or we need to go for the next presentation? So could you please tell us if we have time to?
Let's get into one more question. We have one attendee raising his hand.
Yeah, please, Sandra. I think that you were the one that had the hand. Sandra, ¿podrías hacer la pregunta? ¿Sí está abierto el micrófono? Sí.
Yes, your mic is open. Julio, if you wish to ask your question, please. Thank you very much. Can you hear me right? Yes, I have one question. If the regulatory authority would like to recognize medical in vitro diagnosis devices of the WHO, what's the procedure to follow? Is there any document that details this procedure? And what's the term? Is this a quick mechanism or does it take long?
Thank you. So Ivan, am I allowed to respond?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like the floor is yours.
Yeah. So this is a very good question, and I think I've described a little bit because I was rushing through my slides. But yes, there is a document that guides collaboration with the WHO pre-qualified unit. A document is called a collaborative registration procedure for WHO pre-qualified in vitro diagnostics. So at the moment, we have not started pre-qualification of medical devices. And so this is very specific for a specific group of IVDs. And so I can also share with Sandra the document or a link where you can get information, and not only for the pre-qualified in vitro diagnostics at the moment, but we have also expanded for some kind of it's called facilitated procedure for COVID-19 assays. So if one wishes also to engage in this collaboration with WHO for the listed, not pre-qualified, but listed COVID-19 assays, there is a specific procedure that I can also share a link with Sandra so that you can also familiarize yourself and join. It's not complicated. It's just that you need to fill in a very simple form, one-pager form to show interest on engaging on this collaborative registration procedure, but also the manufacturer of that IVD of interest would need to also consent that WHO shares the outcome or the assessment report with, say, COFEPRIS, and then we would share the information through a very restricted platform that would give access to some of the appointed focal points from your institution. And then the requirement, the only catch is you have to register within 90 days. But WHO is also ready to provide support. So sometimes I tell regulators that use this as a way of capacity building, because once WHO shares this report, assessors are also ready to interact with the experts to guide them through on which are the elements that they should be focusing on so that they can facilitate registration of the product. So I urge you to really reach out. You can reach out to me. I can share my email address on the chat. Let me know if you're interested, and then we'll guide you through this very quick process, and then you get to interact with the WHO assessors.
Well, thank you very much for that answer as well. So then we will continue with the questions from the chat box, and it says, "Thank you very much for the presentation. Which actions can be taken to help sanitary authorities to speed up new registrations, evaluations, approvals in order to respect legal times already in regulations?" In the regulation, actually, yeah.
That's a that's a very tricky question. So what WHO does really is to, and one of the biggest component I think of WHO is really to provide technical support to countries, and so one of the recommendation that I would have, for example, in this regard, is really to get assessed by using the GBT, because the GBT is a tool that systematically assesses the regulatory systems, but also identifies the gap. But once the IDPs, Institutional Development Plan, have been identified, WHO works together with the respective NRA to provide technical support on how to address some of the gaps, so that, for example, if one was in maturity level 2, then through implementation and support provided by WHO to address the IDPs, the regulatory authority will be able to move from a lower maturity level to a higher maturity level. But even though if you're assessed as a maturity level 3 or maturity level 4, WHO has a big component on providing support, but either it should come from specific national regulatory authorities addressing such gaps to WHO, or through the regional harmonization initiatives, we are also able to support specific technical support for regulators based on the priority, because really this one really needs to come from either the regulator or the regional harmonization initiative to cite exactly what is the issue and what it is that they would like WHO to support. But the door is open to support anytime.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for such a great presentation and for such enriching answers to all those questions. So I know that there are so many questions that are not answered, but in terms of time, so we need to move to our next presentation. So thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm so sorry for interrupting. We have time for another couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind. And we appreciate for our next panelist, so we can take advantage of Agnes' presence here. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let me see if we have any other person. Okay, in the chat. Well, we have in the chat box. Yeah, one question in the Q&A box. So we have Clarene Cruz desde INVIMA Colombia. La tendencia sería que en las nuevas regulaciones la armonización internacional.
So the trend is that the harmonization between regulatory agencies should determine the update of the current standards.
I'm not so sure if I got the question right.
I'm sorry, I'm going to rephrase it. She's asking that the trend would be that in the new regulations, international harmonization of requirements between regulatory agencies would determine the update of current standards.
That's a difficult one. But if I understood the question correctly, the WHO is set really to accommodate the different variabilities within countries. And this is why, for example, in the ongoing revision of the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework for medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics, we have invited more than 136 experts from different countries representing all regions to participate in these discussions. And the reason why we did that is to be able to understand the situation in specific regions, understand the situation in specific countries, such that we can accommodate some of the best practices that are happening in these specific countries, or address some of the recommendations that would also cater for countries that are developing systems for medical products. And so we are more really into converging, we are really more into harmonizing and making sure that whatever that is going to be put in the WHO guidance document then caters for everyone. It doesn't cater only for more advanced regulatory authorities, but also those that are in the middle and those that are starting to implement regulatory systems for all medical products. And this is why even when you go through the GRP, the Good Regulatory Practice Guidance document that I've shared, it has clearly indicated that it is the intention of the good regulatory practices to cater even for those that are less resourced. And so I understand COFEPRIS is participating in the discussion. I may have to confirm that. So please participate so that we can also understand the situation in Mexico, but also to be able to learn on best practices, but also to accommodate some of the peculiarities of the different countries or different regions. I hope I got the question right.
No, yeah, definitely. You did it great. I mean, like in this case, it's more related, as you said, when you have this communication with the agencies, and then it's all about recommendations. I mean, WHO cannot. I mean, like, if may say so, I think that they do not take any step on any decision for the agency. So they just provide recommendations, and then each agency, each jurisdiction is able to choose or to implement what fits better for them.
Absolutely.
Definitely. No, I think that,
absolutely.
And we have
and
one. Yeah.
Okay. And just I wanted also to suggest that and encourage participants to ask as many questions as they would wish, because I may need to leave. It's a bit, I've had a long day. It's a bit late on my side. I'll be more than happy to provide written responses as well and send it to the organizers of the meeting. So maybe we should not put a lot of pressure on them, but if there are any questions or any clarification that will be required maybe afterwards, I'm happy to respond on written responses.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. And then with that, I think that we can close this presentation. And for those from the audience who have more questions, so please let them in the Q&A box, and then the organizers are going to send those to Anya as she may be able to respond. So thank you, Anya, for the presentation, and then we will go to our next with our next panelist.
Muchas gracias a ambos.
Thank you very much to both of you. Now we will continue with the next session, and we give the floor to Juan Antonio Dorantes, who will moderate this session. Juan Antonio, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Sandra. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you again today and present this new table of discussion about the regulatory process in Mexico. As you know, it is mainly formed by two components. One of them is the one that regulates the quality infrastructure law, that is a Mexican official standards, procedures for the evaluation of conformity and voluntary standards. And on the other hand, the procedure that regulates the general regulatory improvement law related to regulations in general. Today, we will have two presentations by officers of the General Standards Directorate and the Federal Commission for the Protection of Health Risks. They will explain the vision of each one of the authorities about this. And before giving the floor to the first speaker, I'm going to read his resume. Give me a second, please. Sorry. Our first speaker is Juan Carlos Rivera Guerra. He is Director of Process Improvement and Promotion in the General Directorate of Standards of the Ministry of Economy. Juan Carlos is an engineer in aeronautics, has a master's degree in manufacturing, and among his activities, he is a speaker in diplomas, lectures about quality infrastructure with a specialization in the electrotechnical sector. He's a liaison with the Pan American Commission of Technical Standards and liaison with international standardization bodies, as well as international corporations for quality infrastructure. Juan Carlos is also Secretary of the Mexican Committee for the Electrotechnical International Commission and in charge of the Mexican Catalog of Standards, that is an instrument of transparency and dissemination of the Mexican government that includes the text of the Mexican official standards, projects, and Mexican standards, and also systematic reviews of Mexican official standards and Mexican standards. Juan Carlos, you have the floor. Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. I think, yes, you can hear me. Yes. On behalf of Mr. Alfonso Sanchez, General Director of Standards, we thank you for this invitation to this webinar on good regulatory practices in this Alliance for Standards related to medical devices. Next one, please. I'd like to start with the actions and technical regulations called Mexican Official Standards in Mexico, and with these actions for economic promotion. One of the purposes of Mexican Official Standards is to order domestic markets, giving certainty to economic agents, avoiding disloyal competition and protecting consumers. This is being done by the Ministry of the Economy through different areas. The unit of competition in charge of Jesus Cantu is coordinating competition and technical regulations through the Directorate of Standards. And Mexican standards foster the development of industrial sectors, thus promoting the behavior of GDP. And also we have voluntary standards, but in Mexico it's known as Mexican standards. Other activities to promote commercial transactions, improving the global value chains, and avoiding costs due to over-regulation. The next point is to support the transfer of technology that strengthens and expands the production plant. It is very important for us to incorporate SMEs in the activities of standardization and technical regulation for them to enjoy and leverage this technology transfer that is taking place in technological sectors nowadays. Another point is to foster technological innovation and, of course, research in the production of goods, processes, and services, along with the Metrology Center and some laboratories that are innovating and promoting this technological innovation, always hand in hand with the private sector. With this approach of the Mexican official standards, we can go to the next slide, please. I'd like to show you the outlook today in Mexico. We have 747 Mexican standards in effect, or that will come into effect in the next weeks or months. We have a subdivision in the industrial sector and also healthcare. We have 153 standards in industrial sector, 58 in tourism. We have 7 official standards, agri-food 132 standards, natural resources 107, in legal metrology 20 Mexican standards, and energy sector, exploitation and extraction. Of course, the national electricity system 91, communication and transports 91, denomination of origin, this is also including. We have 15 official standards. Despite we have 17 denominations, we are working in the other 2. And also in commercial information, we have 17 Mexican official standards, labor security 44 standards, and 12 standards for services. Electrotechnical sector, this is our area. At the bottom left, we have 18 official standards. This includes the electricity sector, electronical sector with 4, and telecoms with 8 Mexican official standards, working hand in hand with the Federal Institute of Telecommunications, that is an autonomous body in the formulation of these Mexican official standards. But we also have a very important point in Mexico, which is the Annex of Mexican official standards, Annex 2.4.1. This is a requirement in the country for point of entry and exit of products that are subject to the compliance of Mexican official standards. In this context, we have the participation with 88 Mexican official standards. With respect to medical devices, and while healthcare is also included in the 153 Mexican official standards. Next one, please. We have a classification, but we have the normalizing authorities led by the ministries of states and the concentrated bodies that are in charge of formulating through their national consultative normalization committees these technical regulations that you can see on the screen. We can see some of the standards that have been issued by this ministry. They do not necessarily match the previous classification because there can be a standard from another ministry linked to the healthcare sector, and that's why we have more figures in the first classification. In the industrial sector, we had 53, but the Ministry of the Economy is the main issuer of Mexican official standards. And as a total, it has 144 Mexican official standards. And we can go over each one of the ministry until we get to the Ministry of Security and Citizen Protection that has 1 Mexican official standard. This is official standards. In the case of Mexican standards, we have 4,447 standards divided in the industrial sector, 2,879, agri-food 436, energy sector with 58, metrology 59, services 299, construction with 396, natural resources 264, and healthcare is 56 Mexican standards. In the case of industrial, we have a subclassification in electrotechnical. It has 1,459, 935 related to electricity, and electronics 434. In telecoms, we have 90 Mexican standards. Next one, please. This is the percentage of the body that issues the standards. These are technical committees and normalization bodies. It is very important to say that we are implementing the quality infrastructure law, but and also with the formulation of the regulations, but we wanted to give you the context of the current set of standards that Mexico has. Next one, please. Very well. Now, talking about the quality infrastructure law, I'd like to mention some outstanding elements of this law. The state is the guiding body of the quality infrastructure system. Even though the previous law mentioned leadership, here we recognize and we develop this guidance on the national quality infrastructure system. There are mechanisms for planning and programming of normalization, standardization activities, evaluation of conformity and metrology according to public policies with the National Development Plan. There's an agreement, and also the quality infrastructure plan is a process for planning and programming, and also for the dissemination of the work of Mexican standards that has evolved with the national quality infrastructure law by demanding more requirements for planning and programming. We've identified the issues in this regard, and even though this improves, there's a big challenge in the implementation of the regulations. The next point is we want the participation of the public, social, and private sectors. And in the healthcare sector, we can see that with public hospitals and private hospitals, and how this participation is necessary to achieve objectives set by the ministries of state and also aligned with these public policies through Mexican official standards. And standards, in the next point, we have fostered that the normalizing activity stimulates the domestic economy. This is quite relevant for the quality infrastructure law because through the development of standards for the production sectors, we foster competitiveness. And international cooperation is a guiding principle whereby competitiveness and the integration to value chains through standards. An example we've seen is in cybersecurity is very important. So all the suppliers and those who participate in this value chain generate elements and provide elements to the whole chain to improve competitiveness and the development of our industry. One of the main points from the infrastructure law is the inclusion of the integral technological platform of quality infrastructure that aims to digitize quality infrastructure with processes, paperwork, and all the activities and tasks set in the quality infrastructure law. Next one, please. The purpose and end of the infrastructure law is to set and develop the basis of industrial policy, promote the economic development and the quality in the production of goods and services, of course, expand production capacity and improve value chains, foster international trade and protect the legitimate objectives of public interest that are safeguarded by the Mexican official standards. With respect to the end, we want the participation of the different sectors, a coordination and collaboration with all the stakeholders of the system, from the regulatory authorities, conformity evaluation organisms, normalization bodies, to comply with these standards, and of course, the development of physical and digital infrastructure for the evaluation of conformity. The final point is to foster scientific, legal, and industrial metrology, as well as the creation of the designated metrology institutes. Next slide, please. I'd like to emphasize the legitimate objectives of public interest. The system protects the fundamental rights protected by the Constitution and international treaties, establishes adequate measures for the protection of health, security, environment, education, right to information, food, among others, that are set in Article 10 of the Quality Infrastructure Law. But there's also an identification from the normalizing authorities to identify this need and also produce regulations. Of course, each agency has competence for this protection. Oftentimes, we have Mexican official standards and technical regulations where we define the role and the activities of each one of the participants. Next one, please. This is the regulatory policy cycle. We start with a proposal of Mexican official standard. It does not necessarily has to be the ministry that proposes this NOM, but it is very important to have the elements of the identified problems, and these indicators of the problem should be associated with the objective and the requirements or specifications established by the technical regulation. To this end, they should be enrolled in the Quality Infrastructure Program. This is an annual program with an update of its supplement that is done in May, and the close is in October. It just closed. And now the executive secretary of the Quality Infrastructure Committee is gathering all the information. So then we have the normalization process with the work groups. Then we have the approvals from the respective consultative committees and also public consultations that might be necessary, including regulatory improvements with CONAMER and public consultation with the official gazette. Sometimes if there's an impact on foreign trade, also the notification before or to our trade partners in the WTO. And once this normalization process is over, the normalizing authority establishes the enactment of this technical regulation. One of the main points is the implementation of the Mexican official standards and their surveillance for the compliance and not to produce more problems or something that might happen with the coming into force of this standard. And then we have the systematic review. It's every 5 years. And here we have an iterative process with a proposal of modification in case of modification being necessary. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here we establish the concept of normalization that was described earlier. It is exemplified here. We include the presentation of the response to the comments received during the public consultation in step 4. And it's very important. It gives the stakeholders the certainty because they issue their comments to the Mexican official standards. These are progressive and successive and iterative stages. The first proposal is not the one that concludes the process, but this is a process that evolves. A dialectic scheme. The standards also evolve over time, along with the regulatory improvement process. That is, the impact analysis should evolve as the process of the Mexican official standards goes by. The National Commission of Quality Infrastructure, which is the most important body in this regard, determines the mechanism of coordination between different normalizing authorities when it is their competence. And talking about percentages, it could be 9, 20, or 50-50, depending on the legitimate objectives of interest, of public interest, and the activities that are to be regulated, and also the problems being addressed by the Mexican official standard and they want to address, and also to be the solution to that identified problem. Next one, please. For the implementation of Mexican official standards, there are also other activities like diffusion, training, promotion. These are 3 activities that are done by the executive secretary of the National Committee and the system, because it is very important that people and regulated subjects know the Mexican official standards, the requirements, and the processes. And also we have generation of criteria through technical certification committees. Does not intend to modify the specification of this standard, but rather give certainty to the activities of the evaluation of conformity. And through these collegiate bodies of certification committees, we can generate criteria, the issuance of guides and manuals. Of course, we have a joint standard with the Health Ministry. It's about food labeling. These generated guidelines and manuals for the better implementation, focusing on commercial information, because this is the example we're giving, but we want to have guidelines, manuals, and instruments to guide subjects, because sometimes the standard can be very dry or very general, and thus complicating their implementation. So we have to dialogue with the subjects, and well, we have other activities as well. Next slide, please. Another important element is market surveillance, verification acts, surveillance acts, protection to consumers, the systematic review that will give us indicators and elements to know if the technical regulation is adequate, if it's fulfilling its objective, or if we have to modify it and apply certain characteristics or changes to it. And of course, in the quality infrastructure law, we include the evaluation of conformity of self-declaration as part of the activities of selection, determination, and acceptance of first party, always according to the risk. Very well, if we can go to the next slide. And yes, with this, I would conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation again, and we are here to help you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Your presentation was very comprehensive and very clear for a very complicated process. Well, it's not complicated in operations term, but it's a sophisticated process to ensure quality in regulations. And I think you present this in a very clear fashion. As we've seen, he explained what the purpose of norms is, how we are linked with the objectives of public interest, and how many standards Mexico has, and also an explanation about the elements of the quality infrastructure law, like the new substantive legislation in this regard. And in general, I think Juan Carlos explained very well the normalization process and how it is connected with the evaluation of conformity and surveillance of the market. I would open very quickly the floor for some questions. We have one question from Maria Rodriguez that says, I guess it is for our colleagues from COFEPRIS. And the next one, Patricia Morales, about medical devices. Maybe I can ask this question to you. Good afternoon. I understand that medical devices, only the regulation established for the healthcare sector is the one that applies. Is that correct? Can you give us your opinion? Thank you very much. Here, I could say that many times, many authorities intervene. The Ministry of Economy, talking about medical devices, regulates products related to electrical security, that is to avoid fires or short circuits. And in one of the technical committees of this international committee, they talk about medical devices and establishes characteristics so that it is safe for the user. So I think that depending on the layer of what we are regulating, we could have involvement from other ministries, but always in keeping with the competence of each authority. There should be an intercommunication between all the agencies because these are not isolated processes. It's one user, it's a person, so we have to see that that person is doing well and there's not going to be a failure in the device. So I think these are elements that should be taken into account. I wouldn't say everything is done jointly. It's done in a case-by-case fashion. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Just to add my 2 cents of knowledge about this from the previous law, and the quality infrastructure law also sets this principle, this good practice. I would say that the authorities should dialogue and issue unique regulations as far as possible with respect to products, because as Juan Carlos said, a product can be regulated from different perspectives. In my time, there was an example that we always gave that was fridges. They can have an energy efficiency standard from CENER, a labeling standard, or security for the user from the Ministry of Economy, and a norm of a standard of pollution from Semarnat. I don't know if this standard is in place, but manufacturers only had this standard issued by 3 authorities. So it was used as an example of good regulation because it allowed this convergence, regulatory convergence, and above all, facilitated that the companies that manufacture this may have in a single document all the requirements. So I also agree that this depends on the sector and how ready the normalizing authority is to regulate that product, or if it's a priority. One question I would have, Juan Carlos, if you allow me, I think this is something we've discussed in other presentations, has to do with the compliance from normalizing authorities. But this raises many questions. So who makes sure that the different stages that the leak or the quality infrastructure law for a regulation to be issued from the work groups, how a proposal should be formulated, the instruments that should be used at basis, the elements that a regulatory proposal should include, who ensures that these stages and requirements of the regulation or the Mexican standard are fulfilled. And is there someone who says, yes, this went through the right work groups, we had the minutes, we took international standards as basis. There was an analysis of the regulatory impact. So how do you ensure the integrity of the system? Or is this something pending that needs to be implemented through other bodies? What's your opinion about this? Thank you very much. And I think it is a very good question, because it's not only at the macro level, but each Mexican official standard, each directorate, each subcommittee or steering committee in charge of the follow-up. This is something that is being developed today. Today, we are starting with the National Program of Quality Infrastructure, and not only reprogram issues just because we have the experience of previous years. We made the analysis of how many topics were reprogrammed year after year, and almost 85–90% of what was reprogrammed last year was what was planned for next year. So I think this is a process that is under development. I mean, surveillance that will be in charge of the National Quality Infrastructure Commission, that will be supervised by them and coordinated by the Executive Secretary. But the participation of all the stakeholders will be essential and key, and also in the formulation of standards, to the extent that all the participants may say what the activities are, if there's non-compliance, and if there can be improvements. They are going to help us to be our eyes in this surveillance. And I could make an analogy with the Mexican official standards. Sometimes in electrical products, we detect there's a product in the market that is not complying, and the ones who are complying are those who can see this. Well, please review this because there's something that is not working, obviously based on elements, not only unfounded accusations, but it has to do with development in charge of the National Infrastructure Commission through the Secretary and with the participation of all the stakeholders. Thank you. Very well. Well, if there are no more questions, we can continue with the next presentation. We would ask Juan Carlos if you can stay with us, just in case at the end we may have a debate or additional questions. Now we go with Helga Castillo Barbosa. She works for the General Legal and Consultative Coordination of the Federal Commission for the Protection of Health Risk. Helga has a degree in food chemistry from UNAM. She's a master's degree candidate in public administration, diploma in phyto drugs and health regulations. In her experience, she has worked as analyst for the evaluation of botanical material to obtain new food sources for human beings. She has been assessor in herbs division of COFEPRIS, permits of herbs, classification of products, and then manager of allopathic drugs, in charge of the evaluation of products. And as part of that work, she implemented the renewal of sanitary registries, participated in regulatory amendments. She designed projects related to regulatory reforms, like regulations, among others. She has given courses in several states and abroad related to inputs for health, food supplements, among others. And at present, she belongs to the Executive Secretary of Normatives of COFEPRIS, and she participates in the review of bills for the issue of Mexican official standards and several legal provisions for the regulation, control, and health promotion. Helga, thank you very much for being with us today. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. From the legal coordination of COFEPRIS, I'm going to present the state of the implementation of good regulatory practices at COFEPRIS. Among good regulatory practices of COFEPRIS, it is important to know what these good practices do. They contribute to facilitate trade and investments, as well as improve the business environment through transparency provisions that give certainty to producers, importers, and investors on the regulations. Also, it fosters transparency and accountability when formulating and implementing regulations. This way, they support the development of regulatory approaches compatible between the parties, reducing or eliminating regulatory requirements that are divergent. This regulatory improvement not only impacts COFEPRIS, but also their entities. In what sense? In the sense of the regulatory systems that we are going to mention today, which is medical devices. Now, the regulatory system of medical devices is targeted on validating the safety and efficacy of these, depending on the risk levels associated with the use and their specialization. The legal and technical information is a support instrument for the respective opinions, and standards and regulations set the guidelines for this purpose. In our country, the Federal Commission for the Protection Against Health Risks is the authority responsible for regulating medical devices through the improvement of the regulatory framework to prevent risk against the population. It is important to mention the right to health is a fundamental human right established since 1948 by the United Nations, and it is recognized by many regional treaties and several domestic constitutions. In Mexico, it was incorporated partially in 1983 in paragraph 3 of Article 4 of our Constitution, saying that all persons have the right to the protection of their health. On February 7 of 1994, the General Health Law was enacted that established the basis and modalities for the access to healthcare services and the concurrence of the Federation and the states with respect to health. Finally, in July of 2011, the Constitution recognized as human right everything related to the protection to health. By establishing clearly this right, we needed to have clear legal provisions in terms of health inputs like medical devices. That's why its regulation was established in several legal instruments like the General Health Law, the regulations of health inputs, and some agreements like the equivalence agreements or the deregulation agreements, pharmacopoeia, and Mexican official standards that are instruments that establish the rules that should be observed by any manufacturer of medical devices in our country. Said rules are strengthened with other instruments, not only technical ones, but like the Federal Law of Administrative Procedures and COFEPRIS regulations, so that the administrative act of the health authority is efficient. On the other hand, national regulatory instruments are involved with that is agreed in international treaties in which Mexico is signatory, allowing competent authorities of the member states to provide mutual assistance in the exchange of information that is previsibly relevant for the administration and the application of their internal legislation with respect to these products. There are different treaties and international agreements towards the harmonization and standardization throughout the chain from manufacturing to the distribution of medical devices. And that's why they are quite relevant in the reforms to the legal provisions with respect to medical devices. Next one, please. The first instrument in this regard we have the General Healthcare Law. This is an instrument that establishes in Article 3, which is the health control of products and services in exports and imports and sanitary control of the process, use, maintenance, export, import, and final disposal of medical devices. Said activities will be regulated by COFEPRIS, and they will in charge of issuing the Mexican official standards according to their competence. In addition, the law sets that medical devices aforementioned are considered health inputs. And also this law establishes provisions for medical devices specifying their characteristics, and also the obligation that any medical device that is commercialized in our country should have a sanitary registration, and also establishes general characteristics of labeling. The next regulatory instrument for medical devices is the regulations of health inputs. And here we can see specific elements regarding labeling for these products, and also the generation of Mexican official standards, like the labeling standard for medical devices. On the other hand, it also establishes a very important point, which is the classification of medical devices based on risk. So establishes from class 1 to class 3 specifying that is from lower to higher risk. And there are other instruments with classification criteria that establishes 23 rules, and we should consider in general terms criteria to determine what corresponds to two products that are destined, that the software should be included in the same category, or if a product is not only used for something, it's considered for the classification of a specific utilization. On the other hand, it also establishes the requirements for the health registration and the modifications and extensions, and also establishes the general characteristics of the establishments, and also we have the good manufacturing practices. We also have provisions in health surveillance to identify the verification, safety measures, and sanctions if there are problems with the medical devices. Articles and information for imports and exports, and also adverse reactions. And we also have the techno-surveillance standard, and of course, advertising. The next one, please. The regulations for medical devices has equivalence agreements. These equivalence agreements were published before the increasing need of medical devices to facilitate an access, because we have an equivalence agreement that all the processes are equivalent to what the Mexican authorities demand to guarantee the safety and efficacy of medical devices. COFEPRIS, in collaboration with the Ministry of Economy of Mexico, established an equivalence scheme that contributes to the availability of medical devices for the Mexican population. The equivalence agreement of medical devices, like the FDA and Health Canada, were issued in October of 2010. And there's another agreement in 2012 with the Ministry of Health of Japan, with the purpose of determining the level of equivalence for the issuance of an equivalence agreement. COFEPRIS performed several actions, like analyzing the technical and scientific evaluation procedures to authorize the commercialization of health products in their countries, ensuring that said procedures guarantee the quality, efficacy, and safety of the products. On the other hand, we have other agreements that support the regulation of medical devices, and this is an agreement known as the regulation agreements that lists the inputs, health inputs considered as low risk for purposes of obtaining the health registration, and those products that due to its nature characteristics and use are not considered health inputs, and therefore they do not need a health registration. With all these instruments, we request the criteria of the health authorities, making them less discretional and complying with the objective of good regulatory practices without leaving aside the protection of the population against health risk through regulatory measures. Other instruments that we have and are useful and are more specific for the regulation of medical devices are the Mexican official standards. These standards are technical regulations that are mandatory issued by the competent bodies that establish the characteristics of the processes and services when they can constitute a risk for the safety of people or damage them, or those related to terminology and those related to the compliance and application. These standards have a legal foundation in the law and also in the health input regulations. The projects are made using the normalization process and regulatory improvement process. And we conclude this process. We had the participation of the academia, the government, the industry, and of course, they are subject to consultation for 60 days, as it is set for the legislation, to make the relative adaptations. We address the comments made during the consultation, and finally, as a consequence, we have a final published version in the Federal Official Gazette. In the case of medical devices, we have 3 specific standards that are very relevant. The main one is good manufacturing practices, standard 241, good manufacturing practices for establishments dedicated to the manufacturing of medical devices, that establishes the requirements of the processes from the design of the facilities, development, preparation, mixing, production, assembly, and all the processes of medical devices commercialized in the country, whose purpose is to ensure that they comply consistently with the requirements of quality and functionality to be used by the final consumer or the patient. The other standard related to medical devices is Standard 137 of labeling of medical devices, that establishes the minimum requirements to communicate the information to the users that should be included in the labeling of the medical devices that are commercialized or destined to users in Mexico. And finally, we have the techno surveillance standard. It's standard 240. It's installation and operation of techno surveillance to guarantee that medical devices that are available in the market work as they are indicated. Next one, please. Other instrument necessary in the regulation of medical devices is the pharmacopoeia of the Mexican United States. In 2007, there was an advice related to the pharmacopoeia of the United Mexican States as a supplement for medical devices. Then in 2009, a notice of a cancellation of 37 standards was published belonging to the National Consultative Committee of Normalization Standardization related to medical devices. Then they included this information in those 37 official standards that were canceled, and it was decided to include it in this supplement of the pharmacopoeia so that now we have this latest version that is structured considering methods of analysis, monographies that were included in those standards. So the purpose was to combine all those instruments that were separated and create a single instrument to facilitate also and expedite the evaluation and the understanding for those who needed to apply it. What are the regulatory needs? Well, health is not only a constitutional right, but also a need of human beings. Therefore, along with the technological advances, these needs have been modified so that they have led to new alternatives to treat illnesses and ailments. These advances have led regulatory authorities to implement improvements to give certainty to the participants and also stimulate the trust in the economy and the well-being of society. Therefore, the health authority for an optimal operation has modified the regulation for medical devices so that the rules are increasingly clear and give incentives to stimulate innovation and trust, but mainly that health inputs used by Mexican society are safe and quality products. And these rules have not only been created due to the needs of the Mexican population, but also in the light of international treaties to be in harmony with the regulations of other countries that are trade partners, fostering the internationalization of Mexican products, and in turn, allowing the entry of valuable products and services to improve the social, economic, financial lives of the Mexican society. On the other hand, these treaties allow COFEPRIS to participate in international fora for medical devices, like the International Forum of Regulators of Medical Devices, IMDRF. This was in February of 2011. This was a discussion forum on the actions to be followed for the harmonization of the regulation of medical devices. And we want the homologation of the evaluation tools provided by the PAHO and WHO. So we participated in the development of joint tools for vaccinations, medical devices. I'm sorry, her connection is not stable. And among the regulatory improvements of the COFEPRIS, we have the publication of the Standard of Good Manufacturing Practices, version 2020, that was designed considering an international standard on management systems developed specifically for the manufacturing of medical devices. That is ISO. I'm sorry, I couldn't get the number because her connection is bad. In general terms, these modifications reflect on the implementation of quality systems, quality management systems, manufacturing systems, outsource activities, and good storage and distribution practices. Other regulatory improvements that are underway are the digitization of procedures and automatic resolutions that have been promoted by the Federal Commissioner. Finally, in the quality infrastructure program, we have a standard for technosurveillance. Even though it is harmonized with certain documents, it produces new documentation about the post-commercialization surveillance of medical devices. And therefore, to continue abiding by the best practices, we need a convergence of these standards with the guidelines of the IMDRF through a review and an update. Thank you very much for your attention. This is all I have to present. Thank you very much, Helga. I think you've given us a good presentation. You have explained all the instruments applied by CAFEPRIS to determine the technical specification of the products. And you reminded us the normative hierarchy, how the pyramid has legal instruments applied by COFEPRIS for medical devices and how they are related to the right to health. I think it was a very informative and thorough presentation. I would open the floor for questions. I ask you please to raise your hand. Maybe while we do that, I'll ask you this question. They ask if the equivalence agreement is in effect. The equivalence agreement with Canada, is it in effect? Yes, the agreements are in effect. None has been canceled. And the evaluation timeline, I'm not sure. If you allow me, I don't have the information, but I can look for it. Give me a second. I know, Ivan, if you are there, you have that information.
Aquí tengo el dato a la mano, son 30
Yes,
días.
it's 30 days, applicable for Canada, US, and Japan, and they are still in effect. But they are still in effect, right? Yes, they are in effect, 30 days, according to the agreement. If a medical device is recognized as health input and we want to guarantee their safety and efficacy, and in addition, they should have a health registry in keeping with their risk. Does the electrical safety standards apply? This is for Juan Carlos. Are you there, Juan Carlos? Can you answer? Would you like to answer?
Y mientras tanto, quizá, Helga, preguntan para cuándo se tiene previsto la actualización de la NOM 241.
When do you plan to update NOM 241?
Helga.
Helga? Well, I can answer that question. Who are you? Edgar Arenas. Yes, it's ready for its publication. It's going to be published soon. Yes, that's right. It's about to be published in the Federal Official Gazette. I'm sorry, I couldn't turn on my mic. And the coordination will do this before the end of this year. In December, this should be ready and published. Very well. Well, I have other questions.
Tenemos preguntas aquí dice, ¿han considerado sustituir la NOM 241 por la
Have you
ISO?
considered as replacing this NOM for another one to improve the efficacy and competitiveness of Mexican companies? And also the quality of medical devices? And another question, Nayeli Contreras is asking, is there a plan date for the regulation about software as a medical device? or SAMD?
No sé quién quiera responder.
Ivan, have you considered this?
Edgardo, toda la ISO 13485 ya está contenida en la nueva
Yes,
versión.
it is contained in the new version that will be published of standard 241. Yes, this will be the harmonization with the international standard. Very well. Any other comments about software as a medical device and the regulation thereof? Seemingly, Ivan is a director of this area. Do you have any information? No, this standard is not contemplating this fully. Well, I think these are all the questions. If you allow me, I'd like to ask one more question since Edgardo and Helga are with us. And this is what I was asking Juan Carlos. Basically, I'd like to know, given GRPs' experience in the issuance of regulations, if we go back, the federal law on metrology and normalization that established many of the processes on the stages and good practices included in the quality infrastructure law. This is a law that came into effect in 1992, that is more than 20 years ago, almost 30. And this new law includes many of these topics. And also NAFTA included many of these practices of transparency based on international standards, based on proportionality, necessity, and now the USMCA that came into effect in 2020 includes these disciplines. So how can you make sure in CAFEPRIS that you are complying with all the disciplines of the quality infrastructure law and regulatory improvement law and the treaties to ensure that the regulations are not more restrictive than what is necessary for trade and ensure the proportional compliance of legitimate objectives based on international standards? Is there any mechanism to ensure this? Or what's your vision? Or is this something pending? The need of having these checks in the internal regulatory process to ensure the compliance of this discipline. I don't know, Helga, Edgardo. I think she's frozen. Well, I'd rather let Helga answer this. Helga, can you help us with this? Are you back, Helga? You have to turn on your mic. She's having issues with her mic. I think she can hear us, but we can't hear her. Well, in the meantime, well, the requirements are being considered for medical devices. And if it's possible, we want to go back to a question. Since my colleagues from technosurveillance are here, this is a question about post-sale surveillance. I'm going to give the floor to my colleagues of technosurveillance. Hello, good afternoon.
casos en los que se tiene primero una evaluación de los incidentes adversos recibidos y o también cuando tenemos alguna alerta de algún producto, en este caso de dispositivo médico, se hace un análisis de manera interna en el seno del área. Después de este análisis de lo que se tenga y se haya recabado, se hace el reporte interno. Posteriormente, en caso de ser necesario, se lleva a cabo una reunión con el comité técnico y a través de este análisis, donde en este comité técnico, pues obviamente también participa el área de tecnovigilancia, escuchando las voces de todos y cada uno de ellos, se hace al final de cuentas un nuevo reporte y de ser necesario se llevan a cabo algunas acciones ya definidas. En todo este proceso nunca se tiene algún riesgo de que haya un sesgo por alguna marca de algún dispositivo. Siempre se va a considerar solamente lo que se tenga de informe en cuanto a alertas, en cuanto a incidentes, y sobre eso se va a hacer la acción en cuanto sea necesario, en caso de que sea necesario, la acción final, que sea un cambio que puede ser en el dispositivo médico en cuanto a su etiqueta o ya en casos más extremos hasta retiro de dicho dispositivo.
Muchas gracias. Edgardo, ¿tú quieres comentar algo más? Creo que se quedó un poco congelada la imagen. Helga, no sé si quieres regresar a la reunión anterior.
Todo. No sé si recupera.
Adelante, Edgardo.
No, por nuestra parte sería todo. Muchas gracias. A menos que Helga quisiera agregar algo, pero por ahora sería todo.
No, nada.
This
Muchas
would
gracias.
be everything from us. I'm sorry, I had problems with my computer. Helga, I don't know if you heard the question I asked. Maybe you didn't because you were disconnected. But I was asking if you could share something about guidelines or mechanisms from CAFEPRIS to ensure compliance with the disciplines set forth in the quality infrastructure law in the formulation of Mexican official standards or other instruments like the pharmacopoeia or other regulations. It's the same question I was asking Juan Carlos. How do you make a checklist? How do you ensure that the different requirements, because this infrastructure law contemplates these several requirements that should be fulfilled by the regulations. Some are good regulatory practices, others are about transparency. Take the relevant international standards as basis. Is there something like that, or should it be included later on? It is there in the case of standards, but we have two processes, the regulatory improvement process and the normalization process. So to issue a standard, you have to cover both processes. Even though they are linked, they are not the same one. Some things converge, and everything is documented because it has a process established in the normalization process that is included in the infrastructure law, establishes the steps for the publication of a regulation. And in that regulation, there should be work groups. They have to go through a committee to validate the need. Generally, these needs can come from the users, through the academia or the associations, or even COFEPRIS itself. And everything is reflected on the normalization program that is published every year with a supplement. That's the justification on why it is necessary. All these needs are focused on a request from certain people, or if the authority sees that there are international modifications, and in order to be involved in the harmonization of the regulation, they try to update it as much as possible. And all these processes are documented to verify that we comply with what is set forth in the regulation of normalization and regulatory improvements. Thank you. Thank you, Helga. That's my point. You say it's documented, but it has called my attention how you ensure that you are using the relevant international standard and that you are taking as basis, because it's not necessarily copy-paste, but a codex or an ISO standard or the other regulations that could be applicable in other assumptions. How do you make a risk assessment? How do you make an evaluation of the risk associated with the compliance of
que tienen los tratados, por ejemplo, para asegurar que pues no se emite una regulación que es innecesaria o que no es proporcional para cumplir con el riesgo, ¿no? O sea, hay una especie de manual, lineamiento interno en el cual el funcionario responsable de elaborar el primer proyecto, vamos a decir, de norma, puede hacer un check de, sí, ya chequé la norma internacional, la vamos a usar o no la vamos a usar por estas justificaciones. El proceso, por ejemplo, de evaluación de la conformidad que vamos a escoger, pues va a ser una inspección o una certificación o una prueba de laboratorio, y la razón por la cual vamos a usarlo es porque el producto lo hemos encontrado en el mercado, hay una incidencia enorme de producto no conforme o de adulteraciones o cosas por el estilo. O sea, ese tipo de cosas se tienen o crees que son necesarias o no.
No se tienen como tal un documento publicado en el diario oficial que haga o establezca el cómo debe de hacerse o a qué debe recurrirse. Sin embargo, los grupos de trabajo para la elaboración de los anteproyectos de norma está conformado por especialistas a nivel nacional en las materias que vamos regulando. Perdón, esto es, hay gente que tiene de la industria que está específicamente trabajando con dispositivos médicos, hay gente de la academia, hay gente de investigación de diversos gremios. Todos ellos participan en la elaboración de ese anteproyecto y pueden conjuntar su expertise para poder desarrollar ese proyecto. Eso no es el único trabajo que se realiza, también pasa por otros canales como es la revisión de las diversas áreas para corroborar que pues cumpla con las disposiciones de lo que se dedica cada una, ¿no? La Comisión de Operación Sanitaria, la Comisión de Autorización Sanitaria. Y se van creando, cerrando estos grupos. De esa manera, pues se habla de las buenas prácticas, que además también ya existen las normas, por ejemplo, en el caso de buenas prácticas de fabricación, pues son normas reconocidas internacionalmente. No estamos hablando de normas desconocidas, ¿no? Que se podrían implementar algunas menos estrictas, pero ya las tenemos bien identificadas. Pero en concreto no existe ese documento, pero sí con el expertise de los colaboradores para el desarrollo de las normas y después de los grupos de trabajo y después del comité, es como se hacen este tipo de instrumentos.
Muchas gracias. No sé si hay algún otro comentario. Pues si no, Sandra, te regresaría bueno, hay una pregunta, dice Nelida actualmente, bueno, más bien es una respuesta de Cofepris a una de las preguntas. Dice Nelida, actualmente los criterios de BPF ya incluyen primeros usos de informes y certificado del MDCAP, en particular para dispositivos preautorizados por FDA de clase 1 y 2. Adicionalmente, está considerando la posibilidad de afiliación al programa, ¿no? Es una respuesta a uno de las preguntas. Creo que no hay preguntas adicionales. te regresaría entonces los micrófonos, Sandra. Muchas gracias a todos y gracias a nuestros ponentes.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias, Juan Antonio, Elga, Juan Carlos. Apreciamos mucho sus contribuciones ahora sí que para avanzar en el aprendizaje y en el apoyo de todos los interesados en lograr el mejor marco regulatorio para los dispositivos médicos en México. Para efectos del cierre ya de la sesión, le cedo la palabra a Roberto para unos comentarios de cierre y después me integro yo. Gracias.
Hola, nuevamente, pues quiero tomarme estos minutos para agradecerles a todas y a todos su tiempo y su participación en este taller. Con esto damos por concluido la segunda sesión del taller de buenas prácticas regulatorias y su implementación en el sector de dispositivos médicos. Quiero aprovechar también para recordarles que todavía nos quedan otras 2 sesiones más, los próximos miércoles 17 y 24 de noviembre, en donde vamos a estar abordando los procesos reglamentarios en México y desafíos y oportunidades de la convergencia regulatoria en el sector de los dispositivos médicos. Quiero también agradecer de forma muy especial a nuestros ponentes, a la doctora Agnes Quijo, a Juan Carlos Rivera y a Helga Castillo. Muchísimas gracias por su disposición y por su apoyo. Apreciamos mucho el tiempo y el esfuerzo y el conocimiento que nos compartieron en el día de hoy. También muchas gracias a todos, a todas y a todos los participantes por nutrir las presentaciones con sus preguntas, con sus comentarios, con sus aportaciones. Y quiero aprovechar también para mandar un muy afectuoso saludo a nuestros colegas de USAID, de ANSI, de ADVAMED y a la Coalición Interamericana para la Convergencia Regulatoria. Ha sido un placer trabajar con ustedes en el desarrollo de todas las actividades que se inscriben dentro del contexto del MDRC y que además ha sido considerado como un tema prioritario en el diálogo económico de alto nivel entre México y Estados Unidos. A todos y a todas las que tuvieron la oportunidad de conectarse, representantes del sector privado, de la academia, del gobierno, autoridades extranjeras, muchísimas gracias y nos vemos el próximo miércoles. Le cedo de regreso la palabra a Sandra. Muchas gracias a todas y a todos.
Roberto, muchas gracias. Reitero entonces el agradecimiento y me uno al agradecimiento, Roberto, a todos los participantes y quisiera yo quedarme un poco con esta posibilidad de seguir trabajando justamente a partir de estos últimos comentarios, de esta última pregunta que Juan Antonio formula, encontrando la oportunidad de fortalecer los procesos dentro de la COFEPRIS, tomando la enorme ventaja que tiene de contar con un sistema de gestión de calidad muy robusto, en donde quizá se puede cobijar justamente lo que Juan Antonio planteaba respecto de la verificación, la confirmación del cumplimiento de todos estos compromisos internacionales y evidentemente pues ofrecer el paraguas que nos da, el espacio que nos abre el proyecto de convergencia regulatoria a través de la carta de intención que hemos establecido entre las diferentes instituciones que forman parte del proyecto, justamente para apoyar en estas áreas que entendemos que pueden favorecer los procesos y cumplir con los objetivos que Roberto nos compartía al inicio de esta sesión. Así es de que seguiremos en este trabajo conjunto, en este trabajo colaborativo, identificando estas oportunidades y definiendo ahora sí que cuáles son los pasos y cuáles son las opciones que tenemos para poder seguir fortaleciendo nuestro marco regulatorio y nuestros procesos dentro del marco regulatorio. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias y los esperamos el próximo día 17 para la tercera de las 4 sesiones que tenemos programadas para ustedes. En caso de que tengan alguna propuesta, algún comentario respecto de estas sesiones, les agradecemos que nos las hagan llegar ya sea a través de la COFEPRIS o de la propia coalición. Muchas gracias, que tengan muy buena tarde.